This is a slightly updated version of a talk that I had just given at the ICS Village at DEF CON not too long ago. It feels like forever, um, but I wanted to share with everybody. And I appreciate everybody for tuning in today. I know Saturdays are rough for a lot of folks, so I appreciate everybody for being here, especially being later in the day for most of you. Um, so this presentation actually really came about because there's a song that keeps going through my head when I think about the growing or the escalating path that we're on with just seeing the continued number of cyber attacks against ICS OT environments continually to increase, right, dramatically, you know, and it's always this continued escalation. And the actual song is actually from a band called Megadeth. Some of you might or might not be familiar, but this is actually Megadeth. This is probably Megadeth, 20 years ago when they were in their prime. Megadeth was actually created and named by Dave Mustaine, who's the third gentleman from the left. And he actually is sometimes known most importantly because he actually got kicked out of the metal band Metallica for doing too many drugs, which probably says something. If you get kicked out of Metallica for doing too many drugs, it makes you really wonder. He must have been doing way too many. Not that I'm suggesting anybody ever uses drugs, but just to get kicked out of a band like that for doing too many drugs is really interesting. But his story in part is about his recovery. And as he came out of recovery and working, getting into creating Megadeth as a new band, where he was actually on a flight and he was looking at one of those magazines that he used to have in the back seat of the airplane seat, and there was an article talking about weapons of mass destruction and this idea that it creates. They use the term Megadeth with an A. So he really had connected with that, and fast forward probably about 10-15 years for them, they actually had a song and where it talks about, and it's called Countdown to Extinction, which is where the title of the presentation comes from. And in there, and you'll see it a couple times, and we'll talk about it, as we go throughout the presentation. But there's a line in that song where there's a woman that comes in and she's talking about, the rate is accelerating. Again, it's, 10, 15 years ago, right? ICS OT cyber attacks for the vast majority of the world were very boring because they weren't happening, right? We would have something to talk about every couple of years, maybe every 5 years, where now there's something to talk about on realistically a daily basis. If not a daily basis, I would say at least a weekly or bi-weekly basis. And things have changed, and that's not going away anytime soon. And so it was really this idea of, again, I always hear this thing in my head, right? The rate is accelerating and it's not going to be stopping. Some of you probably have seen this picture in some way, shape, or form, where we had the cyber Avengers, the Iranian hacktivist group loosely associated with the government, but it's an Iranian hacktivist group with very little skill. They have some skill in finding basically these combination PLCs and HMIs that were connected or exposed directly to the internet. This was actually one that I found in Reddit, in the subreddit for PLCs, where I always hide out and watch what all the PLC technicians are talking about. And the Cyber Avengers had found this one. This was actually posted by a gentleman that ran a brewery. And so this was one of the PLCs that they had in the brewery. He had exposed it to the internet. He actually knew what he was doing was bad, and that there was a risk, but he was told he needed to expose it to the internet. I probably didn't get into the details, but probably the boss wanted to look at it from home, right? And he knew this was bad, so he actually segmented it off from the rest of the network, which was great from that perspective. I guess if you're going to expose anything to the internet, wall it off. And he knew that it could become hacked, so he already had his backups, and he was able to restore really quickly. And even in the 4 hours of having to be able to drive to the office and restore, they fell back to manual operations, just like the vast majority of environments that weren't you know weren't prepared, right, for a cyber attack. But we always fall back to manual operations, and so what the environment produces or the service that it makes available isn't impacted. We did see, though, and I think this kind of falls a little bit under the radar when we talk about especially this particular group of incidents by the cyber avengers, is that one, I find I take pride, I guess. The first one actually that you don't hear about was actually in South Carolina. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, but that's where I live. And the other one is that while the vast majority of operations were not impacted, most of these are in water facilities, water treatment plants, that there was one in Ireland that was impacted. And it did take water down for 2 days for 160 people. So is it the end of the world? No, right? But there were 160 people without water for 2 days. And what if 2 days became 2 weeks or 2 months? And what if it was 160 people, or what if it's 16,000 people or 160,000 people? Right? Very different stories, very different impacts. Or I think of, right now what's going on in Cuba not having any power across the entire island. And how long would it take, right, society to break down without reliable power? So I think the worst is yet to come, right? And then I'm not trying to be like, play on fear and uncertainty and doubt. I'm just saying if we look at the history of ICS OT cybersecurity over the last 15 to 20 years and how things have ramped up really since the colonial breach a couple of years ago, that we're on this course where something is bad is going to happen, and I just really hope it doesn't end up impacting that many people. But we talk about looking at over time, though, and this is what I was alluding to before. And when I really got into ICS OT cybersecurity was when Stuxnet came out. I can go back to 1995 when Hackers came out, the movie, if anybody's seen that, right? There's definitely a very strong ICS OT component there, for sure. And I used to work in a bowling alley when I was going to school, and there was a very big OT component there, right? I was installing Windows 95. I was running the front desk when you used the cash register to turn on lanes where people could go bowling. And I also worked in the back doing the repairs. So everything from replacing motors and pin holders and wheels and pulleys and belts to solenoids, right? To be able to activate the system, electronically. But when Stuxnet came out, right, there were a couple things that I always focused on, and right, this was one. Stuxnet was a technological marvel. It still is considered an amazing piece of code, right? And at the same time, when we looked at how it got into the environment, not only how it got into the environment, what it did in the environment, and making the operators in that facility understand or think, right, everything was working appropriately, when really behind the scenes, all the uranium gas centrifuges were spinning up and spinning down and spinning up and spinning down, and they were physically breaking down over time. And so that really started me asking, well, how does this work in power plants and how does this work in water treatment facilities and trains and et cetera. And that was what started me on really my path after, being in IT cybersecurity since pretty much day one. It's what I've always done. It's always what I wanted to do until OT came along. And you can see the big news events and stories. I mean, 2013 for Havocs, 2015 for Black Energy 3, which is when the Russians turned off the power the first time in the Ukraine, right? Two big stories within 5 years, and Havocs kind of really wasn't even a big story for most people. Right? The Russians came back and turned off the power again in 2016, almost a year to the day. Crisis Trident, when it happened in 2017, that's where we thought, ooh, everybody's going to wake up now. Like this is the one event that everybody's going to start understand why OT cybersecurity is important. Because we had the Russians take control over SIS, right? The fail-safe backup for a petrochemical facility in the Middle East. And as Rob Lee likes to point out, right, it's the only reason that somebody would take control over the SIS is to kill somebody. Period. The end. And so it's real fascinating. If you ever get a chance to hear him talk about Trisis, it's a really, really fascinating story. And then you see in Destroyer 2, which is the Russians, trying to create another blackout in the Ukraine when they're just about to go and invade the country again. Pipe dream, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. Right, discovering that though as an automated attack framework, I kind of think of it as like Metasploit for OT. But this idea that we have an attack platform to automate and make attacks in ICS OT environments, and virtually every ICS OT environment, very, very simple. And then we can talk about Stuxnet, which was really interesting in a lot of aspects with the Ukrainians actually targeting Russian critical infrastructure. I think the only problem was it was civilian architecture, infrastructure. Oh no, I have architecture there. and then we're looking at Frosty Goop, which we're also going to talk about a little bit near the end. But it kind of goes back to, a lot of the focus for me is, well, what's the impact of the attack? Frosty Goop has a horrible name, which was given to it by Dragos on purpose to make it a horrible name, apparently. And at the same time, it did turn off heating in 600 Ukrainian apartments in the middle of winter for 2 days, right? Sub-zero temperatures outside, right? That's a huge impact. And this tool, which we're actually going to see how you can rebuild it in ChatGPT in 15 minutes or less, it's not super sophisticated, even if we talk about it as this is a nation state tool that adversaries are using to, take your heating off for 2 days in sub-zero temperatures. And that's what we'll kind of, build up to as we go throughout. Again, it's this idea that over time, right, we start to see, and Hackers was 1995, I need to update that slide, right, that we didn't have a lot of big stories over time. It's very quiet for the most part. When Stuxnet came out in 2010, that was really where we always talk about the opening of Pandora's box, right? Where there were a couple things that really happened. Was one, it was one nation state, really the first case of a nation state attacking another with a cyber weapon. We can say it's the first known case, right? At least for us in the public. And then also there was obviously the control system aspect. And then at the same time, when you had the Americans and the Israelis targeting Iran, you had other countries like Russia and China realizing, oh, did you just see what the Americans and the Israelis did to the Iranians? Not only did they probably realize, hey, they didn't, nothing, there were no consequences, right? Immediately, right? So nothing really happened. There were no consequences for the attack. And at the same time, they realized, wow, Stuxnet is really an advanced piece of malware. we really need to get our act together. Our programs are way behind. That's what at least I think what happens, right? So China and Russia and other countries around the world realized they really need to step up their game. And at the same time also realized nothing happened to the Americans and the Israelis because of Stuxnet, right? Not immediately. And time goes on, right? We talked about it in 2015, right? The Russians turned off the power in Ukraine and they did it again, right? In the middle of winter in 2016. Allegedly, there was also an incident in 2017, but it was fairly limited and I think nobody wanted to talk about make the Ukrainians look any worse. We mentioned, Trident or Trisis in 2017, where we thought that was going to be the incident which was going to wake up the world, and nobody cared. I I even talk with a lot of SIS um, engineers in companies all over, and they don't care. Some do. There's very few SIS engineers that you really want to focus on the cybersecurity aspect. And then 2021, that's when Colonial Pipeline happened. And that was when people really started to notice or to pay attention, at least that I saw. Because with Colonial Pipeline, remember, it wasn't a advanced nation or a state adversary coming in, right? And breaking into the ICS OT network and taking control of processes and having some type of real world impact in the environment. It was just a ransomware group in Russia sending phishing emails to basically every email in the world, trying to get people to click on a link or open up an attachment and infect their system, infect all of the systems on the IT network, and get paid a ransom, right? We've locked all your machines, pay us tens of thousands of dollars in Bitcoin or millions of dollars in Bitcoin, and we'll let you have access to your systems back. And then depending on who you listen to, right, that compromise either did or did not move into the OT environment. It was indicated that it did. So when you think of Colonial Pipeline, again, I think it was where two things happened, right? The world woke up and you have folks like us, right, out in the world, just trying to do our jobs, just trying to live our lives, and realized, oh, there's a real world impact because here you had somebody in the back office click on a phishing attack, and now the United States' largest gasoline pipeline is shut down for 10 days. Where I lived during that time, you would go to the gas station and there was no gas. Now you could go around the corner and another gas station did have gas, but there was a super long line. But there was a real world impact that people saw. And that you'll also start having conversations of how does this impact not only us regionally, but as a nation and national security. And suppliers around the world started to understand, right, how this actually works and how it impacts them. So there are a lot of things that happen with Colonial Pipeline. I know at least for me in my day job, right? There were probably before Colonial Pipeline, I would say 20-25% of our customers did not want to talk to us about OT cybersecurity. We're talking about some of the largest environments in the world. And they say, hey, we have it. I'm like, okay, great. Good luck. Or some, would just say, just leave us alone. I'm like, okay, that's your prerogative. Since Colonial Pipeline, we have OT cybersecurity questions with all of our clients. And that's everybody from Saudi Aramco down to maybe some more localized utilities. Train operators. That's probably a good example of one of the smaller environments. So Colonial Pipeline again really was a big change. And there are, of course, a lot of little stories and things that have happened over the years. Where are we today? I think there's still a big focus on when we talk about, the military activities between Russia and Ukraine. We see some, cyber coupling of attacks between in the Middle East right now with all the conflicts that are happening. I'm mostly focused on, Russia and Ukraine because with Russia and Sandworm, right, the Russian nation state or the state adversary group that's targeting the Ukraine and others, right? They're the most popular over time, being responsible for things like the Trident or Trisis incident. I think I've always just naturally gravitated towards that. But I also find it absolutely fascinating how the Ukrainians are fighting back, whether it's the Ukrainian government, whether it's activists on behalf of the Ukrainian government, and so on. Volt Typhoon is a really um, strong topic, especially for those of us in the United States, right? Where you have Chinese adversaries, where we found them, in a single power station in Guam. And then after we took those indicators of compromise and started looking to see, hey, are they anywhere else? Like, oh, they're everywhere else, right? I think they're pretty much, an environment they weren't in, which was really concerning, right? Which really speaks to the fact that, you know, we're not doing a good job in OT cybersecurity as much as some people think. Rob Lee, has, especially over the last year, talks about, we're not seeing environments do the basic controls like network security monitoring, right? Less than 5% of environments globally do network security monitoring in ICS OT. And I get that because the majority of those environments are really small shops. They don't have somebody for OT security, let alone for OT, right? They might not even have anybody on the IT side of the house. They might just contract one person. We have a lot of that, at least here in the United States. Right? You might go to some small water supplier that has 20,000 clients. Yeah, they don't have any technical resources, let alone engineering resources on staff. So I understand why they're not doing things like network security monitoring, right? And how it can be easy for attackers to get into environments when nobody's watching, and so many environments haven't done the basics of securing their environment, right? That's a big part of what I focus on, is building off of those fundamentals. Again, it's just this idea that these attacks are continuing, right? And we always have this impact. And you can get in the conversation of, well, it's not an OT attack. It took out, just all of their IT systems. Like if you want to say Colonial Pipeline, the attackers didn't get into the OT network, which, okay, we'll go with that. If an entire IT environment burns down to the ground, can your OT operations still run? Right? Is it resilient? And that's a big focus for me. Right? Obviously, in the Colonial Pipeline incident, that wasn't the case. And it wasn't when the port of Nagoya went down or the Australian ports went down, because the systems that they relied on for moving shipping containers on and off ships and moving them on and off the trucks to be able to ship out and then bring new containers on, right? All of those systems were on the IT network. The IT network got hit with ransomware and all the IT systems burned to the ground, right? The ports, some of the largest in the world, shut down for 10 days. So I understand some people want to say, well, that's not an OT attack. No, the attackers did not get into the OT environment, but they had a very real impact on the OT network, right? And the associated processes. Those ports were shut down for 10 days. Colonial Pipeline, the largest pipeline in the United States, was shut down for 10 days. 10 days is always that magic number, right? So at the end of the day, again, I don't care if it's IT or OT. I care about the impact, right? Is there safety issues, most importantly? And then we can look at, yeah, if our environment goes down, How long does it take us to get back up and running and producing electricity or water or medicine, or the list goes on and on. And I did focus on, there were a couple of things to look at, because a lot of what we're talking about, these are not hard attacks, right? We can say, some of these are state adversaries, like when we look at Frosty Goop, or like here, the cyber army of Russia reborn, right? A car. Right. And this actually is a screenshot of an HMI from water environment down in Texas. So Texas is kind of like the southern middle portion of the United States, if you're not familiar. And it's where all of our oil and gas folks are. And so the attackers, and they actually published this video on their Telegram channel. And that's where Wired magazine had gotten it from. So I don't mind sharing it since they borrowed it as well. Where the attackers, right? Once you get to an HMI, and you could literally see they were just basically just clicking like crazy, trying to get something to happen. And yeah, there was a little like water spilled over one of the containers, right? Not the end of the world. Again, it's just I think a hint of what could potentially happen. I don't want anything ever bad to happen. I just think we're on this path, right? That something will happen, right? Because the rate is continuing to accelerate. Sometimes, yeah, things ease up a little bit, but then they just pick right back up and take off. And so we mentioned Frosty Goop, which the Russians had created. Again, this is one where it's not, it's definitely not Stuxnet. It's not what I would call a technological marvel. It's not an advanced piece of malware. It's a real simple tool that they wrote to take advantage of a lot of the poor design features of in particularly like OT systems like PLCs and the protocols that they run like Modbus. And that it did allow them in the environment to turn off, right, heating to 600 apartments in sub-zero temperatures. That's a significant impact. I could only imagine, right, how stressed I would be if I was, a father with little children and trying to take care of my family in that type of environment. Right? It doesn't matter if where you are in the world, right? None of us want to have to experience that type of scenario. And again, this is that line from that song just always keeps getting stuck in my head because the rate is accelerating. We're still, I think, to me, it's like we're in the beginning. Again, I've only really been watching this space since 2010. Again, from 2010, yeah, you would hear of little things over here and here. Like there was the kid in Poland that found out he could use his TV remote to switch the tracks for the subway trains. I'm like, awesome, right? From an interesting like hacking perspective. And it was great that no one really got seriously injured, right? So you have stories like that over time, right, here and there. But now, again, we see those stories on an almost daily basis. And I think what I try, especially when talking with a lot of owners and operators, I think some of them definitely are getting the idea. And I liken it to IT as well. Like in IT, right, finance, financial services, right, banks, they were always the first to really get on board with cybersecurity. They realized how important it was and how vulnerable they were initially. And so they've always had a big focus. In the OT world, that's energy, right? So the energy providers have always understood, for I think the vast majority, right, that they're vulnerable and then they need to focus on cybersecurity. But you have a lot of environments out there that don't, like water. At least, and I speak, from the American perspective, so a lot in the United States, and we see this like in Europe, right? Water providers, again, they just don't see themselves as targets when there's obvious signs, right, that they should. And there are people in the industry, right, that are just, oh, we don't have to do something about cybersecurity and OT today, right, because nobody has died, right? And don't think we can really make that claim. I work for a company where we have people die, every year in construction and engineering. And it's very easy, I think, to see where people have died because of some type of cyber component over the years, whether that's directly or indirectly. That's just me. So when you hear people though talk about we don't need to do anything because nothing bad has happened yet, bad things are happening all around us. And I think for my big focus, and this is something that came over from IT, is in IT, right? Small, medium-sized businesses, if they get hit by ransomware and they go down for 10 days, they shut their doors within 6 months, right? They go bankrupt. They no longer exist. Their employees do not have those jobs and they need to looking elsewhere, right? And then I think of the families that are impacted from that. I think we also see the same thing though in OT. And there's no difference whether you're just solely working in IT or you have some type of OT environment that you're supporting. If you go down for 10 days, and I know many of these manufacturers in South Carolina. South Carolina is a big manufacturing state. Both the Carolinas are. That if they go down for 10 days, again, they don't exist in 6 months. And so that's more of the extinction that I focus on. Not that there isn't a safety component for people in the environment, but it's really what happens to the business. And I have, clients that I work with on the side that if they were down for 10 days because of a ransomware infection on the IT network, a lot of them would be in a lot of serious trouble. Some, they would make it okay. They'd still be hurting. And some would definitely close their doors. So what can we do about it? I know I don't have too much longer. Those of you that know me, right? I'll talk forever. I do focus on, education, more over awareness. There's a difference. Not that there's anything wrong with an awareness, but awareness is a very, high level, right? And giving just little quick tidbits. Where education for me is giving people more information where they can actually make a decision on their own, right? Not because you just told them to do something. So we talk about IT and OT working together, and I've seen the best of this. I've seen the worst of it, and everything in between. Right? And then we can look at some of those basic fundamentals that we can apply, right, to help secure our environments. Because again, at the end of the day, a lot of owners and operators, again, I still see this mostly like for us in the US in water. Water, some manufacturing, even as much as manufacturing is getting killed by ransomware, right now over the last year or so. But some owners and operators still don't see themselves as targets. Yeah. That's a big reason why, yeah, I do focus on education. And it's this idea that, we need IT people to understand OT and how to secure it. We need to take OT people and help them understand IT cybersecurity principles and how those can actually then apply into ICS OT. And that's kind of the principle that you see that different classes out there have built on, like the ISA 62443 courses from ISA, right, are all built around, those are more helping OT folks like engineers and PLC techs to understand the fundamentals of cybersecurity and some 62443 and how we protect OT. And then how do we do that again in reverse for how do we get the IT folks in OT cybersecurity? Because I work with, in my day job, we have 4,000 control system and electrical engineers. And I can tell you I can count on two hands, how many are really, really passionate about cybersecurity. And I can tell you that our 33-person information security team, that the only person that's passionate about OT cybersecurity, right, is me, right? Because not everybody is interested in OT cybersecurity. I think everybody hears us like, well, you should be, right? But like, I get it. I just think the same thing just as cybersecurity in general. How can you not want to be in cybersecurity? Like, you know what? It's not your deal. Like, okay, I get it. So we're never going to have enough folks, right, to get the job done. So we have to be able to work together. That's a big part why I put my course together. I put it on YouTube, right? To help, part of it, right, is a lot of us to work together. And I think a lot of us do. There's a couple of people out there, right, that they're just nasty and they don't have anything nice to say. Right? And we can just hopefully ignore them. For the folks that are here to want to do the job and keep things safe and keep things secure, we can work together on that shared mission. Right? Because some people, and this drives me crazy, when somebody says that ICS cybersecurity has nothing to do with IT security. And some people say it's completely like IT security. I'm like, you're both wrong. And I know they tell me I'm the crazy one. ICS cyber and IT cyber have a lot more in common than they don't. Right? So we have this huge basis to be able to work together. But if you're from especially the OT side, yeah, we need you to help the IT folks understand how they're different, right? Like with vulnerability management. Because yeah, 15 years ago, I would have been the person running into the power plant saying, oh, it's Microsoft Patch Tuesday, you have to patch everything and reboot. Even that HMI running Windows. I'm like, that's not how it works. But we need to help people understand how it works instead of just judging them for not knowing. Right? It's not their fault. And so really it is about, IT and OT coming together. I'll kind of wrap this up over the next 5 minutes. Because we do have a lot of times where IT and OT can be at each other's throats. My girlfriend's a therapist, and so I, kind of liken it now to a bad relationship, right? Whether you're married or boyfriend, girlfriend, boyfriend, boy, girlfriend, girlfriend, your partner, the idea is that if you're either arguing, trying to kill each other, or you're just not talking, right? And you're just upset at each other and you're not talking, then nothing's happening, right? We're not securing anything, and attackers are going to win. I've had these conversations with some of the CISOs of some of the largest ICS OT environments. And some of these environments have horrible communication between OT and IT, where there is no relationship. I'm like, you are just purely vulnerable from the fact that, like in one case, nobody was watching the intrusion detection systems because they were looking at each other like it was the other person's job. And they were fighting over that role or that responsibility, and nothing was getting done. That's really concerning because we're all adults and we can't get along. We can't work together, apparently. But I always say, right, it's not the IT side of the house. It's not the OT side of the house. It's all the same house. So we need to work together to protect our environment, to keep our people safe, to keep the environment up and running, and yeah, and make sure everybody keeps their jobs. And that's honestly one of the biggest focuses for me in cyber in any environment. I, I don't want that environment to go down if there's a chance that somebody's going to lose their job, and then all of a sudden you have a family that they don't have a paycheck coming in, right? Because that's a huge impact to their world, right? So I like this, right? So we should all be happy and hold hands. But again, there's this idea of and also trying to, simplify cybersecurity and OT. I think a lot of people try to overcomplicate it, and some of that's because of this IT OT conflict. And we've come a long way, most definitely, especially in the last 4 or 5 years. But we have a ways to go. But I do want to walk through this, and I'm just going to do this real quickly, just as an example. Again, where we talk about Frosty Goop, again, horrible name, for this state adversary tool that the Russians use to turn off the heating in 600 apartment buildings, right, in the Ukraine in sub-zero temperatures for 2 days. And you'll see there's a ton of slides here, and I'm just going to go through these really quickly because the more important ones are near the end. But one of the things I have been focusing on over the last year and a half at this point is really looking at using tools like ChatGPT to create different security tools, whether it's from a defensive or an offensive perspective. Like how to create a Modbus honeypot, right? And so don't go spend 30,000 on a Modbus honeypot. You can create one for free in like 5 minutes or less in ChatGPT. That works, right? Honeypots don't have to be complicated. But anyways. And looking at, you can take vendor documentation. So Dragos had found Frosty Goop, and so they wrote a report. And you can go through that report, right? You can take all the specifics that they line out, and the team did a great job. You can take all of those specifics. You could feed these into a Gen AI tool like ChatGPT, which I use, and actually come up with a relatively close example of that tool. And here's an example where, this is actually the Honeybot example, because I was trying to make a different point. The point here is if you're trying to do this in ChatGPT, don't feed it like, I want you to do these 10 things in one paragraph. Do it like one at a time, and you'll be much more successful. On the left-hand side, if you do everything at once, it might work. It might work the first time, but if you do it one step at a time, you'll be much more successful. So anyways, so I did want to share that because it says, again, don't try to do it all at once, do it in steps. And if you wanted to put, like, this is like the simple version of the Modbus honeypot. If you want to, you can use that to put it together and play with it. So anyways, so I'm going to kind of skip ahead, but this idea is we can use ChatGPT, we can feed it the information provided by, like in this case, Dragos, to actually build a copy of that tool from as much as we know, right? From that we get from the report. And there were a few things reading the report that really weren't clicking. I'm like, I can kind of see in my head, this is probably kind of close to how it works, but it's not exactly what they were doing, right? And it's really interesting because ChatGPT will do a lot of the coding for you. Like in this case, I just put in the menu item for how to read a register and write a register, which are just placeholders if you're not familiar on things like PLCs running Modbus, and actually created all the code to do that just by me putting in read registers and write just by doing the menu items, which I thought was really cool. But just write a menu. When Dragos actually came back and they did a webinar, when they did a webinar about Frosty Goop, they actually showed the entire command structure. And this is what I was waiting for, because this is exactly what I saw in my head, but I didn't take the time to actually do anything about it until I saw the webinar. Because here's actually the Frosty Goop command structure. It's kind of ugly in a way, but you know what? It kind of works as well, right? Run the tool, connect to this IP address, to this PLC at this IP address. In this case, it's only reading values. It's going to start at like the 10th register. It didn't do coils. It just focused on registers, right? Take the 10 registers from starting at number 10 and read it. And it would show it on the screen, and it would also write it to a log file. That's all that's doing. So yeah, I just went back and took all of that, and each one of those is a line for ChatGPT. So then you come back and this is what it looks like. I call my version Snow Crash. So if you're familiar, there's a book by was it Neil Stevenson that is one of my favorite books of all time. So um, so yeah, and you can here's your like you're reading and here you're also writing, you're making changes, right? So you're updating values on that PLC because Modbus, it's an unauthenticated protocol. You can tell it to do whatever you want it to do. You might just not know what those values are, and that's really the trick when we start talking about right hacking ICS OT in general, right? And then you can even right have it output to a JSON file, like log file. And then the other thing I mentioned is the really cool thing, because this actually becomes a somewhat, I don't know, not super complex tool. It just, there is all the arguments make it really ugly to use, but you can just tell ChatGPT to create a help file, and it's like, boom, it creates the help file for you. And I'm like, wow, like I would never have had the patience to do that personally. And it does that in, I always say 30 seconds or less, which was really a lot of fun to be able to put that together and have a fully functional version of Frosty Goop. Yeah. So we have to focus on the fundamentals of cybersecurity, though. But we also have to realize that, again, not everyone in IT cares about OT security, and not everybody in OT cares about OT security either. So we have to work together to be able to make it happen. And of course, every environment's different. But that's at a high level, right? It takes all of us working together as a community to protect the world at large. That's as easy as that. So I appreciate the time and everybody listening. And then I'll stop sharing so I can actually see the screen and if anybody has any questions. And then there's just some links in case there's my LinkedIn page. If those of you, not familiar with my stuff, I post Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. Eastern. So I have the post there. Feel free to reach out, connect with me, reach out and connect. The YouTube channel that has the free courses. There's the GitHub page, and then my website, and then you can always email me at mike at mikeholcomb.com. So again, I really appreciate everybody for taking the time though to be here on a Saturday. So
Thank you so
now I
much,
can.
Mike. And I see your background is very good. It looks like it's really giving a very good feeling.
It's my industrial background. I think it's the same one that I use for my newsletter as well. So
Yeah. So now we'll be having a question answer session. So next question we have from Prashant. Okay. And what Prashant is asking, that he is asking how critical are active and proactive OT security pen testing solutions in the realm of security with passive monitoring.
so I think it was breaking up a little bit, but I think I got the gist as
So
far
let
as
me
kind of
show you
act.
this.
Oh, okay. Sure.
Okay. Can you see the screen?
Yeah, I can see the screen.
So Prashant is asking how critical are active, proactive OT security pen testing solutions in the realm of security with passive monitoring?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one that comes up a lot. I'm actually talking Monday on this very, very subject. Because when we start talking about whether it's pen testing or active scanning, right, where we're putting packets on the network, right, in the IT environment, that's you do it all day and every day, pretty much, and don't necessarily worry about something breaking. Um, I'm generalizing, of course. In the OT world, right, it's very different. So I would never personally want to do a penetration test or anything like active scanning in a production environment, period, the end, because of the impact that could happen. Now, if I had a client that, has like a small manufacturing facility, maybe a couple $1 million, and nobody's in the plant and it's a Saturday and they're going to say, we want you to pen test the environment. I'm like, maybe. But there's always the concern, right, of what's the impact? And you don't know until it happens. Right. It's like I had a it's like a doctor telling you, right, to take a medicine, and you're like, well, what are the side effects? And they're like, we won't know until you try it. I'm like, well, that's not very reassuring, right? And I think pen testing and active scanning can be very the same. Now that is changing also in newer environments today. I will, there's a big asterisk or a caveat, right? Every environment is different. I would say there are some where you probably could do more active scanning, especially in newer environments. Um, but again, I'm never going to suggest you do it. You have to look at your environment, your systems, right? Your connectivity, understand, can those systems, be able to actively be scanned, or not, right? And I can't make that decision for you. So yeah, my general statement would always be not to do it.
Okay. So thanks for this wonderful insight. So next question, what we have from Ian, that there is a thin line in the categorization of IT and OT attacks. How do we distinguish that? As per me, any attack may be in the IT network zone or industrial zone if it impacts the process of critical infrastructure and it impacts human lives. It needs to be fall into an OT ICS attack. Is this understanding correct or not?
That's one of those, it depends on who you talk to. So for me, I would say if it impacts OT or those things, kind of like you highlight that we're trying to protect in OT, like life, right? Physical safety, environmental safety, and operations. If it impacts that, then I would say that is also an OT attack. But I've come to just be more specific, right? To say it's a attack that started in the IT environment that has an impact in the OT environment. Because if you say this is an OT or an ICS attack, then in general, that implies that an attacker is actually in the OT or ICS environment, and usually with control over the process or processes. And so that's one of those where, especially you can see the fights between IT and OT people, which I think get way out of hand because and they just want to argue for argument's sake, and whether it's not an ICS attack, it's an IT attack. No, it's a OT attack. It's not an IT. At the end of the day, you have an attack that is primarily centralized in IT, but has an impact to the OT environment, right? If your power plant goes down because all of your IT systems are down, right? Whether the attackers in the ICS OT network or not, you're down. You're down. So, yeah, some people love to split hairs in those conversations and get kind of nasty about it. So I would just say try to be as specific as possible when describing those types of scenarios. Like well, that's probably a bad example because I think there's more coming out about that. But yeah, at the surface in the beginning, you could say Colonial Pipeline was all of the IT systems were down, and that based off of a concern of safety, that Colonial Pipeline shut down, right, the pipe in itself.
Okay.
So the OT environment was impacted.
Okay.
Depending on who you talk to,
That's true.
was that an OT attack? Maybe, maybe not, or yes, it was. Again, it just depends on who you talk to.
And end of the day, that if like business is getting impacted due to any attack, so that's you need to understand where that you're having the integration points and how your business is getting impacted. This is what is the feel that we get. So what you are saying, that's correct. That if you're differentiating between the IT and OT attack, that's really sometimes it's very challenging to say.
Yeah, yeah. The other thing that kind of comes up, not to go too long, but when people want to worry about like, well, where's the attacker coming from? Like, is it Russia? Is it China? Is it the U.S.? I'm like, I don't care, right? I just want you off the network, right? And in that case, right, I don't necessarily care to say is this IT or OT. the plant's down and we need to get it back up and running.
Thank you. So next question we have from the IN is that, is there a mapping of security solutions that can be mapped to Purdue reference model? Would those security solutions that can be mapped while dealing zone, segment and micro segments?
So I would say those things probably could exist out there. I don't think I've seen one necessarily. Like when I built the YouTube course that I did, the idea was to the first part acts as an intro to ICS OT cybersecurity and what ICS OT systems are. So for those folks coming from IT, and then it gets into all of the fundamental controls for securing an OT environment, at least from my perspective, right? So like the first section would start with secure network architecture. So we talk about segmentation and build from there, right? It talks about incident detection and response. It talks about we even talk about, I mean, something a little bit more high level like security awareness, right? And the list goes on and on. Conducting risk assessments and so I don't know of a reference that takes different controls and maps them out to the Purdue model. There could definitely be something out there potentially, but when you look at something like network segmentation, right, that just impacts all levels.
Thank you. So we would like to offer any 5 participants who would like to have a direct interaction. They would like to question whatever they have pasted in the chat. They want to ask directly from Mike. Please raise your hand. We will unmute you. Basri, you have posted some question.
Anybody?
Yes, Vasu.
Yeah, so I wanted to try the question in the key way, but I was not able to access. I don't know why. Last time also there was some problem maybe. So my question is, what are the initial signs that can be the indicators for even technical operators who are not from cybersecurity background? And what are the first steps to be taken by them to help the isolation at the early stage of attack?
I think you're coming across a little muffled, but okay, yeah, I see it right there. So what are the initial signs that can be an indicator for operators in the plant, right, that don't necessarily understand cybersecurity, but what they can look out for. For me, I always go back to any anything that happens right outside of normal activity, any alarm, right, even a motor that is whining that it didn't do that yesterday, right? Anything potentially could be a cyber attack. Now, is it right? 99.999% of the time it is not. It's just that 0.001 or 0.01% of the time where it actually is. So it's one of those where if an operator sees something that's just out of the ordinary, then they need to escalate that to the appropriate party, right? Just like they would any really, alarm that came up. Everything should be escalated so that way it could be looked at and it could be investigated. So if you're sitting there, in the control room, and again, it just, especially someone sitting in a control room, they're in there all day, every day for, whether it's weeks, months, or years, they'll get a really good feel. And then if all of a sudden something just feels different, right, they definitely should bring it up and run it by somebody. We actually had a client once upon a time that they had a state adversary in their environment, and I obviously can't get into the details, but they actually found the state adversary because one of the operators had noticed basically a random file on one of the systems that he was using. And he, had used that system for years, and all of a sudden, like, didn't recognize this file. It didn't even look like any of the other files on the system. And he was like, asked, like, what is this? And then it became this investigation and realized, yeah, there was a state adversary on that system and in that plant. I hope that answers the question. It's not a easy one necessarily, but it's one kind of, I guess, in the, you see different like awareness campaigns, right? If you see something, let, or feel like something is off, let somebody know and escalate that so it can be investigated.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks.
No
So
problem.
next is HS. You are unmuted.
Yeah, thanks, Puneet. Hi, Mike. My question
Hey,
is related to post-incident in ICS environment. Usually, for IT, we can easily isolate the system. So, from your experience, we want to understand what are the key challenges in post-incident scenario, and like if you can share us a few experience and live use cases, like during the live incident, what are the key consideration to take care about as part of incident response?
yeah, during incident response at a high level, and then we can come back and talk about after. So, during, I think a lot of people don't realize, and Leslie Carhart does a lot of great, talks, and she puts out a lot of, or they put out a lot of great content on this, since that's, their main job at Dragos. I'll say, thankfully, I haven't been involved in a lot of incidents. So, where they are in the incidents, all day, every day, pretty much. But I think a lot of environments, right, even aren't, a couple of things that stick out to me. They're not prepared for an incident. And again, most environments don't think they're a target in the first place. So if they don't think they're a target, why are they going to prepare to have an incident? Which is changing, especially in manufacturing that's getting hit by ransomware operators these days, so much. So environments have to realize that they're a target so that they can prepare, right? So a lot of environments I still see, right, they either don't have good backups, right, or they think they have a backup of maybe that PLC, right, that they need to restore from backup. And then they go to get the backup, and they might not even know where the backup is, or if they find it and then they go to restore it, it was a bad backup, right? So they never had tested the backup. I've seen that definitely working in different environments, more than a few times, unfortunately. And then there's others where they might just need to physically replace, let's say, a PLC, and they don't have one, or they're relying on their supplier that tells them, oh yeah, we can get you one in 4 hours. Well, what if that's that PLC is in demand, and all of a sudden that week that supplier doesn't have any. I would never rely on a supplier to have something. So I would make sure we know we have physical backups of systems, so we have the spare parts on site, we know where they're at, we have good backups of not only the firmware but the code running on the systems. We know where those backups are. We've tested the backups, right? That's a big part of the preparation. And when I showed that brewery PLC, right? Yeah, he had it back up and running in a couple hours because, it took him a couple hours probably to drive in, but then, he was able to restore it because he knew where the backup was. And so, it was kind of not a big deal. In a lot of these other environments, right? Again, they're not prepared for an incident to occur. So those are some of the bigger things I see. Leslie, fortunately, most of the environments I work in are greenfield environments, right? They're brand new or fairly new. We help design them from the ground up. Some of these projects take 7 or 8 years, even from start to finish to commissioning, and so Leslie Carhart talked a lot about, going into older environments, right? And you see, you're not like in my environments, you might walk in and there's I don't know, Windows Server 2019 running Active Directory, right? In the data center right behind the control room. But like, okay. But they walk into different environments that it's Windows 95 or it's Windows NT. And so, a lot of the responders don't have the tools or capabilities to be able to do things like forensics on those older Windows systems, let alone what if you want to try to do forensics on that Rockwell PLC, right? That do you have the ability and do you have the tools to be able to do that? Would you even know what you're doing? Again, that goes back to preparation. And then I think the biggest thing there is a lot of environments I see, my biggest concern is they don't have a retainer established with an outside firm like a Dragos, like a Mandiant. So that way, when they do have an incident and they need to bring somebody in, they can call them up and say, oh, we need you here. You have to have that retainer in place because by putting the retainer in place, you've done all the paperwork. Because some of that paperwork, at least here in the United States, right, it takes sometimes weeks to get through, right? Lawyers talking with lawyers. And so when you have an incident, you don't want to call up Dragos and say, hey, we need you here today. And they're like, well, okay, we'll get there, but we've got to get some paperwork out of the way first, right? That's not what you want to have happen. So, and then I think post recovery, a lot of it is very difficult for a lot of environments to truly understand even what happened during the incident because they don't do network security monitoring, which is what we were, talking about earlier. And Rob Lee highlighting that only less than 5% of environments doing network security monitoring globally. So the whole point of recovery is understanding, right? You take the attacker completely out of the environment and that you'll be able to restore services in a completely clean environment free of the attacker. If you're not doing network security monitoring, right, you don't know how the attacker got in. You don't know what they've been doing since they got into the OT environment. So how are you expected to truly know that you've removed them from the environment? You don't. So that would be the kind of the other thing that I'm always, concerned with. I think one of the things Rob mentioned of his, I think like his RSA talk or at S4, one of his talks where he mentioned, they go into environments and they're like, the attacker's been in here for a year. He's like, well, that just means your logs show that they've been in there for a year because your retention or your retention period for logs is a year. The attackers could have been there for 3 or 4 years. You just know of the last year because you have logs. And again, it's for the environment that has the logs. Remember, 95% of the time we don't have logs. And if you don't know what the attackers have been up to, how can you truly know they're out of the environment when you go in recovery mode? So yeah, there's definitely a lot there. You could tell I can talk forever, but hopefully that starts to answer your
No,
question.
yeah, that makes sense. And also, like IT, we can do post-incident response tabletop exercise, right? Just to keep all the stakeholders streamlined during the incident response, because
Well, you
crisis
show
communication is critical during the phase.
Yeah, I mean, tabletop exercises are a great way to prepare for incidents, right? To help. I love doing OT tabletops and going in and working with, IT and OT in most environments and understanding what are you going to do when something happens, right? When ransomware gets into the IT and network and the OT network goes down, right? Or what happens if part of the OT network goes down and that's potentially because of a cyber attack, right? How do they respond? Yeah, you have to be doing those tabletops, and then that helps you make sure, do you have your incident response processes documented? Do even just at the basic minimum, right? Do people know who to call to escalate an issue? Just like we were mentioning earlier, right? You have the operator in the control room, and they just notice something just feels off, right? Do they even know who to contact in that case? And if they don't, then you have a big hole in your security program.
Thank you, Mike. We are overshooting, but we have 2 more people. So we would like to know that whether we would like to take those questions or not.
Oh, sure.
They
Yeah,
would like,
no, I'm here.
sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Jabil, go ahead.
Hello, Mike. My name is Zabil. First of all, thank you for the your webinar. It was really interesting. I just have a quick question
Thanks,
about
Bill.
can you give us like your outlook on obviously with this AI and stuff, how we can use AI to improve our defense in the OT side of things?
Sure. It's a great question, Zabil, and I think there's a couple of ways I look at it. So you can go out and you can buy products and solutions now that are building in AI. I think, a lot of, and then there are some vendors that just say our product has AI and that's completely worthless. And then there are some that take it very seriously, and there's some benefit today. I think that benefit is going to continue to increase. I think that's going to AI today is already a million times better than it was yesterday, right? And it's only going to continue to get better, which is great for us as defenders. It's great for the attackers too, but it's great for us as defenders. So as you start seeing solutions that I always go back, like with AI, one of the best things, right, is the use cases for network security monitoring, right? Because we're talking about, well, most environments don't have the resources to do network security monitoring. Well, what if you could have AI do that workload for you and do it very effectively? We're not there yet, but it will get there one day. So that's an awesome, right, use case for AI. Okay, it's not there yet. And if a vendor tells you they're there, then they're, they don't either know what they're talking or about, or they're just outright lying to you, which you don't want to work with those vendors. So, but yeah, AI can be, when we talk about a force multiplier, right? And again, which is really necessary in most of our OT environments because they just don't have the people. And so, yeah, I think solutions are coming. I think we're still probably a year or two-ish from really seeing something that really is going to help people get the job done with a lot, where we don't have to sit there and watch it of every minute of every day to make sure it's not making a mistake. I know there's a lot of operators and owners out there that they're already talking about AI running the plants, and I was like, that's a whole other story. But from a security perspective, yeah, using it as a force multiplier, getting it into solutions like network security monitoring to help environments, especially that are short-staffed or that they do have staff, but we can help the staff that they have do that much more. I think it'll be an amazing place. So, but and then I always.
Thank you for your
Yeah, no
answer.
problem.
That was really
Yeah,
really informative and useful. Thank you.
no problem. And then again, you kind of got a hint. I do actually, if you check out my YouTube channel, there's a video called Hacking ICS OT with ChatGPT, but it's really about creating offensive and defensive security tools with ChatGPT. And so I go back to like the honeypot example. Honeypots do not have to be complicated at all, especially in an OT environment, to determine if an attacker is a network or not. So if you can write a tool like that in ChatGPT and not have to go spend $30,000, right? That lets you spend $30,000 somewhere else. So, but
Thank
thanks
you,
for the
Mike.
question. Yeah, thanks, Abil. Is there
So,
one more?
Basri, you would like to ask the questions? You have a
Okay.
mic access.
Okay. Sorry, I'm Basri. Just a short question. Can I use a ChatGPT to create ICS simulation tools? For example, especially for the transportation, we have a simulation tool for another sector like energy sector and power sector. But for transportation, very less. We can find it in GitHub or in other.
Yeah, no, I think I get the question, and so you can do a lot with it. Now, I will say it is very good at doing things like with Modbus, right? Because you can have it create a Python script, and there are Python modules for emulating Modbus, right? If you're trying to do something more custom, right, then you're going to have to probably work with that to build it out. I've actually started playing with it to kind of create a simulated environment. So I want, a diagram of, let's say, a power plant, right? And then have a simulated environment where you can connect, let's say, to, we'll just say like a PLC or DCS, make changes to the PLC or DCS, and then see the power plant go offline. I mean, right, very high level, simple example, but that kind of gives you an idea. I think it's very doable. But again, like in that case, I'm using Modbus, which is it understands because of those Python Modbus libraries. So if you're trying to do something a little bit outside of the box, you're just going to have to build it with ChatGPT. But I think it's very, very possible. The interesting thing too is you can tell it or you can ask it, right? Can I do this? Can you help me do this? Right? And it'll tell you, right? And it'll actually walk through that process. And I've started to see some pretty interesting and complex examples of applications people have put together using ChatGPT. For me, I don't want to invest too much time. I just want to, I'm not a developer. I don't have that patience. And so, I probably spent maybe 2 hours max on any of my ChatGPT projects. So, but it's very possible. I guess it's one of those you won't know until you try it. If you're using, again, something like Modbus as like a basic communication protocol, it'll help make it that much more easy because again, it understands Modbus very easily. Hopefully that answers your question though.
Thank you, Mike.
Hey, Mike.
Mike, we have a core team member who would like to have one question with you.
Sure.
Hi, Mike.
This
Hi,
will be
Mike.
the last question.
Chitrang Srivastav. So probably I have one question for you. I mean, typically
Sure.
you talked a lot on the collaboration on IT and OT, and definitely coming from the industrial control system background, I understand there are certain gaps, and the requirement is to bridge the gap between it. But then at the core, there are a lot of things when it comes to OT cybersecurity, because cybersecurity is all about risk management. To understand that those risks, you need to understand the inner core processes, how the boiler is operating, what are the points which can result in the safety tripping of a boiler.
Yep.
So
Sure.
what are your views in setting up an independent OT GRC program within an organization from an end user perspective, and whether that is going to help implement a right kind of a focused program typically to secure the operational security environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think at least in the United States, right, with looking at OT and I think GRC, I immediately think NERC, right? We have a federal regulation which we're required to adhere to as energy providers, right? And so it's a very easy sell to say we have to have a GRC program in place to ensure we're compliant. And at least in the United States, and I think this is in most countries, right? Most OT environments they're not regulated, right? Most aren't. And so without regulation, if you want to say a company is going to have a GRC program, they're going to say, well, what are you compliant against? right? There's no regulation, right, from your government, whether it's at a country level, whether it's, you know, at a more local level or anything in between, right? What are you compliant with? And then you can talk about 62443 or NIST 882 or, you know, a few of the other alternatives out there, or your own policies, right? And standards and procedures. So I think in general, right, with GRC, I think it's a great idea. I think in many environments, and I liken it to IT, right? And 20 years ago, right, in IT, right, GRC wasn't a thing, right? You weren't even auditing, right? You didn't have auditors because you weren't required to do cybersecurity. And then as some environments had to do cybersecurity because they were told to by their government, right? Then they started having compliance programs. They started getting audits. And then there were other environments, right, that maybe they didn't have a regulation that they fell under, but they realized they had to take cybersecurity more seriously, right? And so that's where they would have their own program, which is great. I think it's going to be the same thing in ICS and OT, that you're either going to need regulation and something that you have to measure against, right, to have a program, or you're going to have an organization, you're going to have an asset owner or operator that's going to take cybersecurity so seriously that they're going to invest and authorize a GRC program. But otherwise, I know at least today, right, the vast majority of environments in OT, right, if they're not doing something like network security monitoring, let alone maybe basic network segmentation, the last thing they're thinking about is GRC, right?
Correct. No, so why I'm curious on this, because the kind of ecosystem I've seen across in the industries. Typically, when it comes to GRC program, everything starts from the governance model. So you want to fix all those things, you want to bring up all those solutions, but then you need to have certain mechanisms that you need to identify people who will be managing it. You need to identify who will be team who will be running out all those risk identification, vulnerability management kind of thing. So that is where I believe a focused GRC will definitely help, and that is where I was curious to understand, because otherwise it becomes a chaos sometimes, because the expectations in terms of IT will be different. Probably you may not fit all the IT recommendations to the OT. They need a separate kind of vulnerability management program, or maybe a policy, password management policy, or user access level requirements, backup management, or most of the things are different. And typically when you talked about incident response, which is again on a bigger level, it comes as a part of a policy. The crisis management for OT maybe slightly different. So that is where I just wanted to add a lenses like, okay, should an organization think over on this perspective and start putting those lenses, like, okay, yes, if you want to do a holistic program for an organization, typically focusing a cybersecurity program, IT and OT all together, we need to have a set of standards which are totally aligned to OT, and that should focus for OT, and then IT something for IT, and gradually it should collaborate at certain level of.
Yeah, and I think you will see that in larger environment like a Saudi Aramco, a Shell, BP, right? They're going to have those programs, but you have to remember that's like less than 1% of the OT environments out there, right? The others, they're just not going to have that. So we really have to rely on, and then this depends on every environment, right? Is it the IT team that's in charge of the OT security? Is there an OT team that's responsible for OT security? Is it a combination of both? Right? It always just depends. Every environment is unique. Every environment's different. So we have to look at them, individually. And, ideally everybody can work together and that's the nice thing, I think, with OT, and you get into, I guess, compliance, but and risk is that if you are in most environments, that at least the ones I work in, right, see 62443 as their basis for their cybersecurity program in OT, and the central focus is all around the risk, right? The risk assessment, identifying, right, the controls you need to apply, et cetera, et cetera. So I think in a way, some ways, OT is better off because of that, if you can convince environments that they need to follow the 62443 path. But that's convincing environments they need to do something about cybersecurity in the first place, right? So, but
yeah, definitely. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks for the question.